Okay, good morning. I'm Sister Virginia Jung from the Benedictine Sisters of Chicago and the archivist at St. Scholastica Monastery here in Chicago. And this presentation is a poster session that is based on an assignment I did a year ago at this time in LIS 701 at Dominican University. And that's the entry-level class in the Library of Information Science program, and its core values, ethics, and issues in the library and information professions. So, and I shared the handout because I know the poster is squished, that we had to get a lot of information on there.
That handout is included in the meeting invitation that I sent out, so there should be a PDF in that invitation.
Yeah. So if you see here where it says, this is a quote from Pope Paul VI, it means giving to ourselves and those who will come after us the history of the passage of this phase of Transitus Domini in the world. And that was, as I was doing research, I kept seeing that quote in these documents that were from the Vatican about archives, and I tried to eventually track down where it came from. He was talking to a group of Italian church archivists in September 1963, which is just after he became Pope. And that expression really intrigued me, this idea that the archives held the story of the passage of God, this phase of the passage of God through our world. Because I really hadn't thought about what I was doing in that light. But what I was finding were these letters that had come from the Vatican about religious archives and encouraging people, bishops, and religious superiors to be looking to their archives and taking care of them. And of course, the Vatican has archives, but I hadn't ever really thought about that before. But they do. They have two well-respected schools of archival studies, the Vatican School of Paleography, Diplomatics, and Archive Administration, founded in 1884, where students learn their craft in the secret archive, and then the Department of History and Cultural Heritage of the Church at the Pontifical Gregorian University, which offers bachelor through doctoral degrees in church cultural heritage studies. And that helped me understand the professionalism that was expressed in the documents I read. The other piece that intrigued me was their emphasis on evangelization and the pastoral function of archives, things I also had not thought about. I am a pastoral counselor most of the time when I'm not archiving, and so I was trained in professional clinical counseling and to see things through a pastoral lens, constantly asking, what's pastoral? In other words, what's reverent, what's compassionate, what's peace-building, what's empowering, what is holy, where is God in this? And so it was interesting to think about doing the same thing for religious archives. Another thing that caught my attention was in a 1994 letter from the Pontifical Commission for the Cultural Patrimony of the Church that was directed to the major superiors of men's and women's communities. They were talking about software for religious archives that would be available at no cost to all communities. That was something I really wanted to track that down, but that did not get off the ground, that initiative. Too bad. And also, as I was exploring this research path, I saw, this was happening a year ago, that Father Columbus Stewart, a Benedictine priest from St. John's in Minnesota, was being recognized by the National Endowment for the Humanities for his work in support of people in war zones where they hold ancient texts, sacred texts, and they want to keep them there. They don't want to send them anywhere, but to digitize those in case they should be destroyed by violence, which is extremely sad but very important work. And so much of what he was talking about also echoed these same values that I was reading about in the Vatican documents. And so on the poster, you see those. We were learning in class about the SAA core values, right, and the Code of Ethics. So in that top row are values that were mentioned in the Vatican documents. They were, to convince bishops and local leaders, religious leaders, that your archives need to be run in this way. And then I was lining them up with the SAA core values. Whoops. What happened? I'm going to go back and find it.
It looked like you temporarily at least stopped sharing the presentation. So if you just go back and reshare that, it should work.
No, but the screen went black. That's why.
Oh, well, that's not very helpful.
There. Okay.
All right.
Here it is. Okay, so there it is. You see it, right? So, of course, evangelization is not an SAA core value, so it's over there on its own. But when they talk about congruent access, that matches up with the idea of access and use, to document faults and encourage good, corresponds with accountability, outreach to local church leaders, is a way of doing advocacy, respect for non-Christian cultures, is honoring diversity, memory, along with history and memory, preservation, qualified personnel, and professionalism, good management of the historic archive and responsible custody, selection and autonomy, service, collaboration with civil bodies, along with social responsibility. It was just how I lined them up, right? And so as I was reading about other kind of religious archives, I found examples of these things in action. So, for example, with evangelization, in an article that Malachi wrote, Malachi McCarthy, he talks about religious community records document in a personal way the struggle of individuals to lead a religious life in contemporary society. Okay, so you can see I'm Catholic, ours is a Catholic archives, people have different religions and different religious archives, but hopefully in the documents you see their faith being, put in action in people's lives. And that can spread that joy and beauty to other people who get to read them or look at them. For the congruent access, that it provide access without prejudice, following published policies and procedures is an expectation. Try not to touch it. So in documenting faults and encouraging good, there's probably lots of examples, but for example, in South Africa, the archives show the conversion of the church, really, that initially, it's part of the system, and so was just going along with apartheid, but then gradually, due to conscientization, liberation theology, came to see things a different way and began to support the struggle for freedom, and so the archives show that conversion process. That it's important to participate in national and international organizations to educate leadership about archives, as well as the contributing members, is advocacy on part of the archives, advocating for itself, that it be well managed and well supplied. And diversity, to respect non-Christian cultures. That's the Vatican, so whatever religion it is, to be respectful of all other cultures and religions. And HMML, Himmel, is the manuscript library at St. John's that Father Columbus Stewart works with. And they support guardians of endangered sacred texts from all faiths. as they digitize collections to save them from war and climate change. And they also really promote that the people, teaching people to digitize their own materials. It's not about getting the materials and bringing them to St. John's, but that people are empowered to do that for themselves. For memory, religious communities' chronicles of daily events provide context for other archival materials. For preservation, knowledge on how to preserve older materials varies widely across the spectrum of religious archives. And I would say not only older materials, but newer, in the digital age, knowledge of how to preserve that also varies widely across the spectrum of our archives. Qualified personnel, in the Vatican documents it says, religious archivists have the right to receive adequate training. An example that I found of good management of a historic archive is the Vincentian Fathers transferred their provincial archive to DePaul Special Collections and Archives. So when they saw that it was going to be hard for them to keep maintaining it, they made sure that it was in an excellent place to keep it going. So that's showing some responsible custody of their archive. For autonomy, that the archive have the right to select what their mission is and what they're going to keep and how they're going to participate in other efforts. So for example, the Sisters of Providence in Indiana, St. Mary of the Woods, Indiana, they have their archives, but they also choose to house some of their collections in the Wabash Valley Visions and Voices Digital Memory Project. So that's a state, along with IU and the State Library of the State of Indiana. So it's not a religious archive, but they, considering themselves just neighbors, people who live in this area of the state, participate in a local archive, digital archive as well. Service to collaborate with educators to develop plans to open archives to students of all ages would be an example of that I read about in the literature. And also then collaboration with civil bodies in Chile during the 70s, the 70s, the 80s, the military regime. Again, the church is part of the system. So in some ways, some of the people were complicit in what was going on, but there was also in the background people from the church gathering documents, gathering evidence of human rights abuses, and that then became helpful to getting justice once the military dictatorship was ended. And that's something that as I was, doing this research and thinking about this topic, I also had very present in my mind the sexual abuse crisis in the church and how much, that information is not necessarily in the archives as much, maybe in records where sometimes those are separate, but still, to approach the subject with humility and realize that we could say these are values, but do we always live them? And that has become much clearer and much more explicitly stated that yes, but it didn't come from the church, it came from civil law, that yes, these can be subpoenaed and this information needs to be available to seek justice, and at the same time to realize that is God at work in the world, in my opinion, is seeking justice in where abuse has occurred. So I did also want to say that when I was asked to be the archivist for my community, it was like on a Wednesday in July in 2016, and maybe on Friday or Saturday of that same week, I met Rebekah McCarthy at a meeting of the American Benedictine Academy, which was fortuitous. And then through Rebekah, I met the Chicago area religious archivists, and I met the Chicago area archivists and the Midwest Archives Conference. And so before I ever knew that there were core values or code of ethics, I did notice about archivists that, how welcoming they were and enthusiastic about their work, but also with real values that you talk about in conversation, at conferences, but also in conversation with each other. And it did really strike me. I'm like, how do they all know about this? Or why so many of these people think similarly about things? And then eventually it did, when I learned about SAA and the values and the ethics, it's clear that it is something that's really instilled in people and that you do share and debate and discuss and just bring into your everyday life and work, whether you're not necessarily in a religious archive at all. So good for you, and thank you for that, because it made it easier for me to get into the work. I think for me, the main thing to take away from the research I did for this project is that it's important to engage in reflective practice, which is true no matter what kind of archive you work in, and that you keep in mind that all the work you do is so that others can use the materials for some purpose of theirs, and to keep those users, as well as the original producers, very present in your mind. And I was touched in one of the articles, they talked about a student who was doing research in a religious archive, and she said it was really almost like sacred space. Like, she didn't say it was sacred space, but it was almost like sacred space. And when I was, coming up with the title, I did the same thing. Like, their potential is sacred space. We're so afraid to claim that. But they are sacred space, and it's important for the archivist to contribute to that by approaching their work with reverence for the stories and the lives and the materials and the researchers, and with enthusiasm to get those stories out there and to get the stories used in meaningful new ways. So that is what I have to say initially about this, and I would welcome questions, or I know a lot of the Chicago area religious archivists, some of you are here, if you wanted to say anything about your own experience with your archives, I'm sure we would love to hear that. So I know, Julie, you are monitoring the chat, right? If there's anything anyone want to ask or say.
Well, one person did want to know if you would be able to make this slide available so that people can take a look at it after the presentation. So
Yeah.
Okay. If you want to send that to me, then I can.
To email it as an attachment to you? Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll figure out how to make that available.
Okay.
And then we had it wasn't so much a question, but a comment here, the larger mission. Closing.
I cannot hear you.
All right. Now, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You might be able to also hear some drilling going on. I have a lot of background noise. The comment was, a larger mission of religious archives is also interesting. Sad scenario about the announcement of the potential closing of Mercy Hospital in Chicago. But that order has very organized archives, and even though out of state, we'll be watching, monitoring, retrieving as necessary. And there's also a link provided in the chat. Follow through with that. We do have a question. How do we convince religious organizations that archives are important?
Well, I'm fortunate, as a Benedictine sister, there is a long tradition of archive keeping in Benedictine monasteries, like since the Middle Ages, probably. So I think, but on the ground level, it is challenging sometimes to communicate to people what to keep and how, and to send it to the archives on a regular basis. So I think working directly with people as much as you can, for example, meeting individually with department heads, with whoever it is that you think is supposed to be sending material to the archives, meet individually with them. And then another idea that I recently heard, and I'm going to do it in a workshop of Benedictine archivists, is to then prepare a spreadsheet based on what they told you about the documents they produce, and what you agreed on should come to the archives, to then give that spreadsheet back to them so that they can use it, something concrete they can use to organize themselves and get the materials to you. If it's about like funding for the archives, I am fortunate in that my community, as much as they don't necessarily send me the documents, they do if I need boxes or a scanner or something, I get that. So I think reading, if you in the like reading those documents that this talks that they've given from the Vatican about the importance of archives, there's pretty convincing material in there that I think you could adapt to whatever your religion is, you know, and use some of those arguments, or not arguments, but use some of those just talking points are pretty effective, I think. I don't know, do other religious archivists want to chime in on that? How to convince organizations that the archives are important?
And also, Joe, who's the one who asked the question, he noted he struggled with the Diocese of Gary to establish an archive. So I don't know, Joe, if you want to talk about that at all. Maybe that could foster some more questions or discussion.
I can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Yep.
So for a while, and it was a little bit of an odd situation because I was the lone Protestant working for a Catholic college as their archivist, and they were willing to have a Lutheran because I was willing to work cheap. So that was the joke. They told me I'd get half now and half later when I worked for them. But the Diocese of Gary really didn't seem to want to either fund or have an archive, and we were willing to do the work. And even when we brought up the fact that I believe it was a papal bull from some time that they're supposed to keep them, they still really had no interest and sort of blew it off. And as we see churches close, especially in like Northwest Indiana where I'm at, a lot of that information is going to be lost, and that's not just religious information, but cultural information for the area that they serve, and it's there's an importance to it, and I just don't know how we can convince churches, dioceses, religious organizations to have these once they're once the funding starts to leave. So I don't know if there was something. It wasn't a fully formed idea, so I apologize for that. But I was just wondering if you had any tips or ideas, and I will mute myself again.
This is Jerice Barrios. I work for the Senecal Sisters here in Chicago. Um, as far as diocesan records, I mean, don't they keep the sacramental records? So baptisms, marriages, wouldn't those records be compelling enough to convince them that they need to keep them? I mean, people, genealogists and people want to learn about their family history would obviously want to refer back to those types of records. And if they're not keeping them, who is?
That was also my question that I had for them. So I don't know. That was the scary part for me, living in such a large Catholic community and having those records leave as the population dwindles.
Yeah, that's really sad that they don't even see the value in those I consider very important records. If they don't even see the value in that, then I don't know who you were talking to, but that was a hard case right there. I mean, that person had no interest in history whatsoever, I guess.
Yeah, that was a few bishops ago, and he was I think he had short timer syndrome. But yeah, it was shocking because I thought baptism records at minimum, wedding certificates, like come on guys, burial stuff. I don't know, maybe that's important. So I don't know.
I think
Rebekah McFarland noted that she's lucky that the order she works for, Sisters of the Living Word, have always had a strong respect for archives. Even with that in mind, found that discussing the archives as an aspect of legacy has been very useful, and reframing the archives as the more permanent aspect of perpetuating Sisters' charism. So there's another point for you. We have another question here. Is it the responsibility of the diocese to archive a Catholic college's archives?
I would say, in just by my experience, and anyone else who wants to comment, please do, but by my experience, I would say no, it's not their responsibility, but they might do it because, just for example, we had two law, over 100-year-old girls high schools, one in Colorado, southern Colorado, and one here in Chicago, and both of them closed within recent memory. And the school in Colorado, the archdiocese there, or the diocese there, did not want to keep any records of the school. And so those all came here. And they had an archive. They had a nice archive established, and that's here in Chicago now. And all the kind of historic stuff is in our archive, and one of our sisters keeps the school, the student records separate from that, so that when people want transcripts or things, she just takes care of that. For our school in Chicago, the student records went to the Archdiocese of Chicago. They were set up to do that. They had no problem taking them, and so if an alumna wants her, needs transcripts or something, or proof that she graduated high school, she can do that through the Archdiocese. And then some of the things that they decided to keep came to our archives from the school. But so just based on that experience, I'd say nope, they don't have they don't have to do it, but they might. And some archdioceses around the country do take in the archives of small religious orders that close, but some don't. It just depends, I think, on the diocese and probably how they're set up, if they have the capacity. But individual dioceses are supposed to have an archives. They're pretty much required by the church to have one. So I'll go higher up in Indiana to the next level and check on that.
I'd like to make a comment about the spiritual value of our archives. I was very impressed. Mother Teresa, of course, in addition to her great public humanitarian work and spiritual leadership, all her life was struggling not so much with her faith, but with her feeling of separation from God, except for some very brief periods in her life. And she recorded all this in her journals and her papers. And after her death, these documents, which could be considered as controversial, were all published and made available, and journals are preserved. So I think that's an example of the value of archives of documents as far as preserving them, and also the integrity of making them available. Not trying to present a prettified picture, but showing the real spiritual struggles which even a woman like Mother Teresa goes through. And I think that's certainly been beneficial to me, and I think to many others as well.
Well, that could be a very good point to end on, for we are reaching 10 o'clock, the end of our presentation time for this one. Does anybody have any final questions for Sister Virginia? We do have a comment. I think it is important to note the importance of the linkages between religious archives and other institutional archives, such as hospitals, whose roots are in the church. Predecessor hospitals of my organization are in the Lutheran and Methodist churches. All right, do we have any other questions or comments for Sister Virginia or about her presentation? Well, we're going to wrap up for now. Thank you very much, Sister Virginia. That was an excellent presentation, really informative. Our next one starts at 10:10, so we've got about a 10-minute break. I'm going to stop recording for now. We will see you all back online in 10 minutes.